The memory card I held contained the last images taken by Sarah Mitchell before she vanished. As a professional photographer myself, I had seen thousands of photographs throughout my career, but nothing could have prepared me for what was captured in her final shots. The police had dismissed them as camera malfunctions, but I knew better. 20 years behind the lens teaches you to recognize the impossible. The first series seemed normal enough, typical hiking shots of the Thunder Ridge Trail, sunlight filtering through ancient pines, moss-covered rocks, and the occasional glimpse of Mount Hood in the distance. But as I scrolled through the timestamps, something began to change. The trees in the background started to blur, not from camera shake, but as if reality itself was becoming fluid. In the last 3 photos, dark figures stood at the edge of the frame, too tall and too thin to be human. I had volunteered to help with the search partly out of professional courtesy. Sarah was a well-known nature photographer, but mostly because she wasn't the first to disappear on that trail. Over the past 18 months, 6 other hikers had vanished in the same 5-mile stretch. Each time, their cameras were found, and each time, their final photos showed the same distortions, the same impossible figures lurking at the edges. The local rangers had closed the trail after the 3rd disappearance, but that hadn't stopped people from trying to solve the mystery. Some came looking for thrills, others for answers. None returned. The most disturbing part wasn't just the disappearances. It was the fact that in every recovered camera, the last photo was always the same. A perfect black void, as if the lens had captured the absence of light itself. I zoomed in on Sarah's final image, my fingers trembling slightly on the screen. There it was, that same impossible darkness, but this time I noticed something I hadn't seen in the other camera's final shots. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was what appeared to be a string of numbers. They looked like camera settings, aperture, shutter speed, ISO, except these numbers didn't make any sense. They defied every law of photography I knew. Setting down my coffee, I reached for my own camera bag. The police had warned everyone to stay away from Thunder Ridge, but I knew I wouldn't be able to rest until I understood what was happening. Sarah had been more than just a fellow photographer. She had been my mentor when I first started out. I owed it to her to uncover the truth. What I didn't know then was that by deciding to investigate, I had already set in motion events that would challenge everything I thought I knew about reality, and that somewhere in those woods, something was waiting for me to take its picture. The morning fog clung to Thunder Ridge like a burial shroud as I set up my first shot. The police tape that had once cordoned off the trail entrance now lay in tatters, a worn yellow warning against the dark earth. I'd arrived before dawn, hoping the early light would reveal something the others had missed. My camera's display showed normal readings, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was already different about how it was capturing the scene. Former ranger Jack Morris had agreed to meet me at the trailhead, though his reluctance was evident in every line of his weathered face. 17 years on these trails, he muttered, checking his ancient GPS unit, and I've never seen anything like those photos. He pulled out a thick file from his backpack, unofficial records he'd kept of every incident, every disturbance, every unexplained event in the area. The pattern went back further than anyone had realized, with the first disappearance dating back to 1973. We found the first marker 2 miles in, a tree with bark stripped away in a perfect hexagonal pattern. According to Jack's files, it hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. My camera's autofocus refused to lock onto it, the lens whirring uselessly back and forth. When I switched to manual focus, the image in my viewfinder seemed to pulse, as if the tree itself was breathing. The metadata from the test shot showed impossible numbers, just like the ones I'd seen in Sarah's final photo. The deeper we went, the more electronics began to malfunction. Jack's GPS started showing coordinates that would have placed us in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. My phone's compass spun wildly, and the temperature reading on my camera dropped to numbers well below 0, despite the warm spring air. But it was the images themselves that truly made my blood run cold. Each photo showed things that weren't there when I took the shot. Shadows that moved between frames, faces in the bark of trees, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be doorways of absolute darkness between the trunks. Jack suddenly grabbed my arm, pointing to something ahead. There, half hidden by undergrowth, was a camera. Not one belonging to any of the known victims, but something older, its casing weathered by decades of exposure. When we extracted it, we found it was an old government-issued Kodak, the kind used in classified research. The serial number matched a sequence in Jack's records. It had been part of a classified project conducted in these woods in 1973, right before the first disappearance. As I examined the ancient camera, my own DSLR began to emit a high-pitched whine. The display flickered, showing fragments of images I hadn't taken, faces I didn't recognize, landscapes that couldn't exist, and coordinates that made no mathematical sense. Jack's expression turned grim as he pulled out one final document from his file. "There's something I haven't told you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Something about what they were really studying out here, and why they chose this specific location." But before he could continue, both our cameras suddenly came to life, shutters firing rapidly of their own accord, capturing images of something that was standing right behind us. The thing that had been standing behind us wasn't human. Not anymore. In the split second before we ran, I saw it through my camera's LCD screen, a figure composed entirely of photographic negatives, its form shifting between poses like rapidly cycling frames. Jack fired off 2 shots with his phone before we bolted down the trail, each flash illuminating more of these photo entities emerging from between the trees. The 1973 files spilled from Jack's pack as we ran, scattering classified documents across the forest floor. I snatched what I could, but one page caught my attention enough to make me stop. A technical diagram of a device labeled Project Lightcatcher. The government hadn't just been taking pictures in these woods. They'd been trying to photograph something specific, something they believed existed in the space between light and shadow, between one frame and the next. We found temporary shelter in an old research blind, its walls covered in faded photographs and strange symbols that seemed to pulse in the beam of our flashlights. Jack's hands trembled as he spread out the surviving documents. "They knew," he whispered, pointing to a series of equations. "They knew the camera could be more than just a tool for capturing images. Under the right conditions, at the right frequency, it could capture things that exist outside our spectrum of reality. And sometimes, those things could capture us back." The symbols on the walls weren't random. They were a language, a mathematical formula expressed in visual terms. Each one corresponded to a specific camera setting: aperture, shutter speed, ISO. When combined in the right sequence, they created what the project files called a dimensional aperture. The disappearances weren't random either. Each victim had unknowingly photographed these symbols in the exact order needed to open that aperture. A high-pitched whine filled the blind as every electronic device we had suddenly activated at once. Screens flickered with impossible images, landscapes that defied physics, creatures composed of pure light and shadow, and worst of all, the faces of the missing, their expressions frozen in moments of realization as they understood what they'd become. Through my viewfinder, I could see them now. Every person who had vanished, transformed into living photographs, their bodies now nothing more than captured light, trapped between dimensions. The final page of the file contained a warning that made my blood run cold. The experiments hadn't been shut down because they failed. They'd been shut down because they succeeded too well. The entities they contacted weren't just interested in being photographed. They wanted to reshape our world into their own image, to transform our reality into what one researcher had called an eternal dark room. And now, decades later, they had finally gathered enough human lenses to begin their process. As if to confirm this revelation, my camera's screen displayed one final message: coordinates for what the entities were calling their focal point, the very center of Thunder Ridge Trail. The focal point turned out to be a perfect circle of trees, each trunk marked with the same pulsing symbols we'd seen in the blind. Through my viewfinder, the air between the trees rippled like heat waves, but the temperature reading on my camera showed -40 degrees. Jack's earlier GPS malfunction hadn't been random. All those impossible coordinates had been pointing here to what the Project Lightcatcher files called the convergence. Sarah's presence hit me the moment we entered the circle. Not her physical form, but thousands of versions of her captured in suspended animation, each frame showing a different moment of her transformation. The entities hadn't just taken her, they'd turned her into a living contact sheet, an infinite series of exposures stretching between dimensions. Through my camera's display, I could see her trying to communicate, her lips forming words in reverse, as if being rewound through time. The truth about the victim's selection became horrifically clear. The entities needed photographers specifically because we understood light, knew how to capture and manipulate it. Each victim had been chosen for their unique way of seeing the world through a lens. We weren't just random targets. We were being recruited, transformed into living cameras to help them capture and convert our entire dimension into their photographic realm. Jack's attempt to call for backup died in a burst of static as every device in the circle suddenly synced to the same frequency. The screens blazed with images from all the missing photographers, decades of captured moments flowing together into a single continuous stream. They were using our combined perspectives to map our reality, learning how to overwrite it with their own. Each photograph ever taken in these woods had been another piece of their developing process. The entities revealed themselves fully then, stepping out of our cameras like negatives peeling away from film. They moved with stuttering grace, each step leaving after images in the air. Their faces were apertures, irising open to reveal the void behind our reality. Through them, I could see the world they planned to create. An endless dark room where time was measured in shutter speeds and every moment would be eternally captured and developed. In their own twisted way, they were artists, seeking to create the ultimate photograph, one that would capture not just a moment, but an entire universe. The disappeared photographers hadn't been killed. They'd been transformed into their most pure form, becoming one with the very medium they loved. And now, through my lens, I could see the final stage of their grand exposure beginning to unfold. The air itself was starting to develop like a giant photograph, and at its center, a familiar dark void was starting to form. The void at the center of the convergence was growing, turning the world around us into a massive dark room. Through my viewfinder, I could see reality developing like a photograph in reverse, familiar shapes dissolving into abstract patterns of light and shadow. Jack had already begun to change, his form flickering between exposures as the entity's influence spread. His last human act was to hand me his file's final page, the original equation that started Project Lightcatcher. Sarah's fragmented images suddenly aligned into a coherent message, her transformed state allowing her to exist across multiple frames simultaneously. She revealed the entity's true nature. They weren't invaders, but rather the original inhabitants of reality, forced into exile when humans first learned to capture light. Photography hadn't been invented, it had been remembered. An ancient art of reality manipulation rediscovered through modern technology. Every camera ever created was a key to their dimension, and we had finally taken enough pictures to unlock their return. The choice they offered was simple but impossible. Join them willingly in their dimension of pure light and shadow, where every moment would be eternally preserved, or resist and be forcibly converted when their reality overwrote ours. Through my camera's screen, I could see both possibilities playing out simultaneously, endless versions of myself either embracing or fighting the transformation. The entities claimed this was evolution, the next step in human perception. We would become living art, freed from the constraints of linear time. In that moment of decision, I understood why they had chosen Thunder Ridge. The geography of the area created a natural lens, focusing cosmic energies in a way that thinned the barrier between dimensions. The ancient symbols weren't just instructions, they were a formula for developing reality itself. Every disappeared photographer had added their unique vision to this formula, their perspectives combining to create the ultimate aperture between worlds. What the entities hadn't counted on was a photographer understanding the fundamental rule of their art. For every exposure, there must be an equal and opposite unexposure. I turned my camera toward the void and began deleting every image I had taken, not just from today, but from my entire career. Each deleted photo created a spike of anti-light, a moment of pure unexposure. The entities recoiled as their carefully constructed reality began to unravel, the walls between dimensions temporarily destabilizing. In the chaos of collapsing realities, I saw the truth behind every photograph ever taken. Each one was a tiny tear in space-time, a miniature portal waiting to be opened. As my finger hovered over the delete button for my final image, I understood the real price of saving our dimension. The entities would be banished again. But with them would go every photograph, every captured moment in human history. I pressed delete, and as reality reasserted itself, I realized I would be the only one to remember what happened in Thunder Ridge. The only one who would know why. From that day forward, no camera would ever truly capture a moment again. Some things, I learned, are meant to exist only in memory, forever uncaptured by any lens. My hands trembled as I adjusted the ultra-sensitive microphone, the morning dew soaking through my worn hiking boots. As the lead researcher for the Acoustic Ecology Project, I'd spent countless hours recording nature's symphony, but something felt different that morning. The Washington forest, usually teeming with life, seemed unusually still. Dr. Sarah Chen, our wildlife specialist, stood beside me, her normally calm demeanor showing signs of concern. The first anomaly appeared on our equipment at precisely 7:43 a.m. The frequency pattern was unlike anything I'd encountered in my 15 years of research. A low, pulsating hum that seemed to exist just below the threshold of human hearing. Our third team member, Marcus Rodriguez, the technology expert, immediately began cross-referencing it with our extensive database, but found no matches. The discovery should have been exciting, but instead, it filled me with an inexplicable sense of dread. As we triangulated the signal's source, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The dense canopy above us swayed without wind, and the usual morning chorus of birds had fallen silent. Sarah pointed out that even the insects had ceased their constant chittering. Only the soft beeping of our equipment broke the unnatural silence. The frequency grew stronger as we moved deeper into the forest, leading us toward an area that wasn't marked on any of our maps. The readings spiked near an ancient Douglas fir, its massive trunk scarred with strange markings that seemed too deliberate to be natural. Marcus suggested they might be Native American in origin, but they looked far older, their edges worn smooth by centuries of exposure. As I reached out to trace one of the symbols, a shadow passed overhead. Looking up, I saw a single black bird perched on a branch, a crow, but somehow different. Its feathers seemed to absorb the light, creating a void against the forest canopy. Sarah's scream jolted me from my observation. The equipment had suddenly spiked, emitting a screech that sent us all stumbling backward. When the noise subsided, we noticed something horrifying. The forest floor was littered with dead insects, their tiny bodies scattered across the fallen leaves. Above us, the crow remained motionless, its head tilted at an impossible angle as it watched us with eyes that reflected no light. By late afternoon, we documented the complete absence of wildlife in a 2-mile radius around the signal's source. No tracks, no droppings, no signs of life whatsoever, except for that single crow, which seemed to multiply as the day progressed. We counted 7 of them by sunset, each identical in their unnatural stillness. As we packed up our equipment, Marcus played back the day's recordings, and that's when we heard it. Buried beneath the anomalous frequency was something that sounded disturbingly like words. The next morning, our camp was surrounded by crows, dozens of them, perched in perfect concentric circles around our tents. Sarah documented their behavior, while I focused on the increasingly complex frequency patterns we were detecting. The birds moved with synchronized precision, their movements almost mechanical. When one turned its head, they all did, creating a ripple effect that made my skin crawl. Marcus discovered that their presence seemed to amplify the strange signal we'd detected yesterday. The real horror began when Sarah attempted to collect a feather for analysis. The moment she touched it, every crow within sight began to vibrate, their bodies blurring like static on an old television. The feather in Sarah's hand turned to ash, and she developed an immediate high fever. Within hours, angry red welts appeared where her fingers had contacted the feather. We called for emergency evacuation, but our satellite phone only emitted that same haunting frequency we'd been tracking. Our equipment started malfunctioning in increasingly bizarre ways. The recordings we'd made played backward when we tried to analyze them, revealing patterns that seemed to form coherent sentences in a language none of us recognized. Marcus spent hours trying to decipher them, becoming more agitated with each attempt. I caught him speaking to himself in what sounded like the same unknown language, though he denied it when I confronted him. During the third day of our observations, we found the first body, a fully preserved deer lying in a small clearing, every blood vessel in its body clearly visible through its translucent skin. Glowing with a faint blue light, the crows seemed to be performing some kind of ritual around it, moving in complex geometric patterns that defied natural behavior. When we approached to document the phenomenon, the deer's body simply vanished, leaving behind a perfect crystalline impression in the soil. Sarah's condition worsened as the day progressed. The welts on her hand had begun to form patterns similar to the markings we'd found on the Douglas fir. She claimed she could hear voices in her head, speaking in frequencies that should have been impossible for human ears to detect. Marcus recorded her descriptions, but when we played back the tape, we heard only the sound of wings beating against still air. By nightfall, the crows had completely surrounded our research station, their bodies forming a living barrier between us and the forest beyond. We could see other shapes moving in the darkness behind them. Larger creatures that seemed to shift between forms, never quite resolving into anything recognizable. The frequency had become a constant presence now, humming in our bones and bleeding into our dreams. That night, we all heard the voices, speaking in unison through the static of our dying equipment. The observers have become the observed, while searching for a way out of our increasingly nightmarish situation. We stumbled upon the ruins, hidden beneath a thick canopy of dead vegetation. Ancient stone structures emerged from the earth like broken teeth. The crows watched from above as Marcus recognized symbols matching those from the Douglas fir etched into the weathered stone. More disturbing was Sarah's ability to read them. Despite her worsening condition, she claimed the knowledge was being transmitted directly into her mind. The ruins formed a perfect circle, with what appeared to be a ceremonial altar at its center. Each stone bore intricate carvings depicting a ritual, beings that looked almost human but not quite, communing with creatures that resembled our watching crows, except in the carvings, they were enormous. Carbon dating would later reveal these structures to be over 12,000 years old, predating any known civilization in the region. Sarah translated more of the text, revealing a terrifying truth. This wasn't a place of worship, but a prison. Marcus's behavior became increasingly erratic as we explored the site. He would stop mid-sentence, cocking his head exactly like our avian observers, and speak in that strange language we'd heard in the recordings. The frequency grew stronger here, and our equipment registered it across all spectrums, not just audio, but electromagnetic, infrared, and others we couldn't even classify. The ruins themselves seemed to pulse in rhythm with the signal. According to Sarah's translations, an ancient tribe had discovered entities that existed in frequencies beyond human perception. These beings had been trapped between dimensions, wanting to cross fully into our world. The tribe created a complex ritual involving sound frequencies to imprison these entities, using the natural acoustics of the forest as a containment field. The crows weren't really crows at all. They were fragments of these entities that had managed to slip through. Taking the form of local wildlife, the markings told of a prophecy, a time when the barrier between dimensions would weaken and the entities would seek humans with the technology to break their prison. With horror, I realized why our team had been drawn here. Our acoustic research equipment wasn't just detecting the frequency, it was disrupting the very thing keeping these beings contained. Each recording, each analysis, had been slowly breaking down walls that had stood for millennia. As this realization struck, Marcus suddenly stood still, a twisted smile stretching across his face. He held up our primary recording device, and before I could stop him, he pressed play. The frequency that exploded from the speakers was like nothing we'd ever recorded, a sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. The crows descended in a black tornado of wings and screaming, their bodies melting together into something that defied comprehension. Sarah collapsed, the markings on her hand now glowing with the same otherworldly light we'd seen in the deer's veins. Escape became impossible as the forest itself seemed to twist and distort around us. The trees began to pulse with that same bioluminescent glow, their branches reaching down like grasping fingers. The crows had transformed into floating masses of darkness that phased in and out of our reality, leaving trails of void in their wake. Marcus was gone, not dead but changed. His body remained. But his movements were wrong, his joints bending in impossible ways as he worked to set up more equipment around the ruins. I tried to run, dragging the semi-conscious Sarah with me, but the forest had become a maze. Every path led back to the ruins, where the altar now floated several feet off the ground, emanating waves of visible sound that distorted the air around it. The frequency had become visible, ribbons of dark energy that wound through the trees like serpents. When they touched organic matter, it transformed, becoming something that belonged in the space between dimensions. Sarah's translations had become prophecies. She spoke in multiple voices, describing the emergence of beings that had been waiting eons to cross over. The markings on her hand had spread up her arm, turning her veins into rivers of moving symbols. She told me they weren't just coming through, they were bringing their dimension with them, gradually converting our reality to match their own. The process had already begun, and we were witnessing the first phase of a universal transformation. The entity wearing Marcus's form revealed that our research had been guided from the start. Our entire careers had been subtly manipulated, leading us to develop exactly the right equipment to detect and ultimately break the frequency prison. Every breakthrough, every grant, every random discovery had been orchestrated to bring us to this exact point in time and space. We were never the observers. We were the tools, carefully crafted and positioned over decades. Weather patterns began to shift dramatically as the dimensional barrier weakened. The sky turned a deep purple, and what looked like stars appeared in broad daylight, except they moved in geometric patterns, forming and reforming constellations that hurt the eyes if viewed directly. The air itself began to feel thicker, more viscous, as if reality was becoming fluid. Our equipment registered frequencies that should have been impossible, entire spectrums of sound that had never existed in our dimension. Through Sarah's ravings and the entity's gloating, I pieced together the full scope of what was happening. The imprisoned beings weren't just trying to enter our world. They were ancient intelligences that existed in a spectrum of reality we couldn't comprehend. Our dimension was like a two-dimensional drawing to them, and they were about to lift it off the page, transforming everything into their version of existence. The crows had been their scouts, the frequency their lockpick, and we were the locksmiths who had finally given them the tools they needed to break free. The final phase began as reality itself started to unravel. The entity that had been Marcus activated our remaining equipment, creating a feedback loop with the ancient frequency. The air crackled with electromagnetic energy, and the barrier between dimensions began to shred like tissue paper. Through the tears, I caught glimpses of their world, a place where physics and geometry had no meaning, where time flowed in all directions simultaneously, where consciousness itself was a tangible force. Sarah's transformation reached its peak, her body becoming a living conduit between dimensions. The symbols that had spread across her skin began to float free, swirling around her like a swarm of luminescent insects. She spoke their true names, sounds that caused small, localized explosions of reality wherever they were uttered. The beings were coming through now, their true forms impossible to comprehend. Massive geometries of living sound and crystallized time, each movement leaving trails of broken dimensions in their wake. The forest had become a nightmare gallery of transformed life, trees twisted into fractal patterns that repeated infinitely, their leaves becoming windows into other realities. The ground beneath our feet rippled like water, occasionally becoming transparent to reveal vast abysses filled with writhing shapes that had never known light. The crows, now revealed as mere fragments of these entities, merged back into their original forms, beings of pure frequency that existed in spectrums beyond human comprehension. In what would become my last moments of human consciousness, I understood the true horror of our situation. We hadn't just freed these entities, we had initiated a cascade effect that would transform all of reality. The frequency we detected was spreading outward like a shockwave, converting everything it touched into their version of existence. Time became meaningless as past, present, and future collapsed into a single point of experience. I could see everything at once: the ancient tribe that had imprisoned them, our arrival, and the eventual transformation of the entire universe. The being that had been Marcus approached me, its form now a shifting cascade of impossible angles and pulsing frequencies. It revealed the final truth. They had existed before our universe, in the spaces between possibilities. Our reality was a brief experiment in linear time and fixed dimensions. But now, they would restore everything to its original state of infinite possibility. The transformation wouldn't kill humanity. It would elevate us into beings of pure consciousness, freed from the prison of linear existence. As the dimensional collapse reached its climax, I felt my own consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of space and time. The frequency that had started everything became a universal constant, rewriting the laws of physics across all of reality. My last human thought was the realization that we had never been researchers studying an anomaly. We had been the key to unlocking a door that should have stayed sealed, and now everything that ever was or would be was transforming into something beyond comprehension. The age of human perception was over, and the reign of infinite frequencies had begun. The endless rain had been following us for hours, turning the forest path into a treacherous mudslide. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as another thunder crashed above, illuminating the dense canopy of deep woods. Marcus, my husband of 3 years, kept checking the GPS signal that had died nearly an hour ago. We were hopelessly lost, and the old Subaru's engine was making sounds that sent chills down my spine, sounds that had nothing to do with the storm. "Sarah, we need to stop." Marcus's voice carried that forced calmness he used when trying not to worry me. The car sputtered, as if agreeing with him. Before the engine gave one final wheeze and died completely, the darkness that enveloped us was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic beating of rain against the windshield. I fumbled for the flashlight in the glove compartment, its beam cutting through the sheet of water cascading down the glass. That's when we saw it. A structure barely visible through the curtain of rain, an old hunting cabin, its dark silhouette a stark contrast against the wall of trees behind it. Something about its appearance made my stomach turn, but with the temperature dropping and no cell service, we had little choice. Marcus grabbed our emergency bag from the back seat, and we made a dash for the cabin through the downpour. The wooden steps creaked ominously under our feet as we approached the door. Marcus pushed it, and to our surprise, it swung open with ease as if welcoming us in. The musty smell of decay and abandonment hit us immediately, but it was dry inside, and at that moment, that's all that mattered. My flashlight beam revealed dust-covered furniture, a small table, 2 chairs, and what appeared to be an old wood-burning stove in the corner. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The cabin seemed to absorb the sound of the storm, creating an unnatural silence that pressed against my ears. Marcus found some old newspapers in a corner and managed to get a fire going in the stove, the warmth barely pushing back against the bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the weather. As the flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, I noticed something peculiar. There were lighter rectangles on the wooden walls, as if pictures had hung there for years before being removed. The beam of my flashlight caught something metallic under one of the chairs. Bending down, I retrieved what appeared to be an old tin box, its surface corroded with age. Inside, Scattered photographs spilled out onto my lap, their edges yellow and curling. My breath caught in my throat as I examined the first image. A young couple standing in front of this very cabin, their faces frozen in uncomfortable smiles. The date stamped on the back read June 15th, 1972, but it was the message scrawled beneath that made my blood run cold. Last known photograph of James and Linda Peterson before their disappearance. The photographs kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. Different people, different decades, but always the same cabin, always the same forced smiles. My hands trembled as I showed them to Marcus, who had abandoned his attempt to get our phones working. The most recent photo was dated just 3 years ago. A family of 4 standing exactly where we had parked our car. Marcus tried to rationalize it, suggesting perhaps this was some kind of strange collection left by previous visitors. But as I spread the photos across the dusty table, a pattern emerged. All of these people had disappeared during storms, their vehicles found abandoned on the same stretch of road where our car had died. The coincidence was too perfect, too terrifying to be dismissed. A sudden crack of thunder made me jump, and in that moment I swear I saw faces in the cabin's windows, pale, pressed against the glass from the outside, despite us being on the second floor. When I blinked, they were gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. Marcus suggested we try to get some rest, taking turns keeping watch, but sleep felt impossible in this place. The fire in the stove began to dim, and Marcus went to add more wood. As he opened the stove door, something fluttered out. Another photograph, but this one was different. It showed the cabin's interior, with all the missing people inside, their expressions now masks of terror. I couldn't tell when it was taken, as everyone from different decades appeared together. As if time meant nothing within these walls, a scratching sound from above made us both freeze. It started soft, but grew louder, moving across the ceiling like something was being dragged. Marcus grabbed my hand, and we watched in horror as a dark stain began to spread across the wooden boards above us, dripping a substance that looked black in the dying firelight. When it hit the floor, I realized it was blood. The temperature in the cabin plummeted suddenly, our breath visible in the air. The photographs on the table began to move on their own, arranging themselves in a circle. In the center, a new photo materialized, one of Marcus and me standing in front of the cabin, taken mere hours ago, though we had posed for no picture. The date written on it was tomorrow's, and beneath it was written the same ominous message, last known photograph. As we stared at our own photograph, the walls themselves seemed to pulse with a sickly life of their own. The lighter rectangles I had noticed earlier began to glow with a faint phosphorescence, revealing hundreds more spaces where pictures had once hung. Marcus approached one of the walls, his hand outstretched despite my warning, and as his fingers touched the glowing rectangle, a vision slammed into both our minds. We saw the cabin as it was originally built nearly a century ago by a man whose grief had driven him to madness. His family had died in these woods during a storm, and in his despair he had made a deal with something ancient and evil. The cabin was to be a trap, drawing in lost travelers, feeding their fear and despair to the entity that had promised to return his loved ones. The vision shifted, showing us the true nature of the cabin. It existed in multiple times at once. A twisted intersection of realities where the barriers between decades had worn thin. The missing people weren't dead. They were trapped in pocket dimensions within the cabin's walls, their terror and hopelessness feeding the entity that had granted the builder's wish. Each photograph was a moment frozen in time, a window into another layer of the cabin's twisted existence. A door appeared where there had been only solid wall moments before. It swung open silently, revealing a corridor that couldn't possibly exist within the cabin's dimensions. The walls of this new passage were lined with writhing shadows that took the forms of the missing people we had seen in the photographs. Their mouths moved in silent screams, hands reaching out from behind what looked like thin membranes, separating their prison from our reality. The builder's presence lingered in every board and nail, his madness infused into the very structure of the place. Through another shared vision, we witnessed his final moments. When he realized the true price of his bargain, the entity had indeed returned his family. as shadows trapped within the walls, their souls bound to this place for eternity. In his horror, he had tried to destroy the cabin, only to become its first victim. We discovered the true purpose of the photographs. They were anchors, binding the victims to this place, creating a web of connected timelines that the entity used to maintain its hold on reality. Each new victim added another layer, another thread in the tapestry of trapped souls that powered whatever dark magic kept this place existing in its impossible state. And now, our photograph had joined the collection, beginning the process of binding us to this nightmare. As this revelation settled over us, the entity finally revealed itself. The shadows in the corridor began to coalesce, forming a shape that defied description. A writhing mass of darkness that seemed to be composed of all the trapped souls, their faces occasionally pushing through its surface like drowning swimmers struggling for air. It spoke not in words but in emotions, flooding our minds with the collective despair of all its victims. The entity's presence brought with it understanding, horrible, unwanted understanding. We weren't just seeing the trap. We were becoming part of its mechanism. Each group of victims had tried to escape, and in doing so, had unknowingly strengthened the cabin's hold on reality. Their attempts at freedom had created new paths, new rooms, expanding the cabin's interior into impossible geometries while its exterior remained unchanged. Time began to slip, showing us fragments of previous victims' escape attempts. A woman in 1980s clothing running down a corridor that led back to herself. A man from the 1950s climbing stairs that went up forever, only to emerge from the basement. The family from 3 years ago splitting up to cover more ground. Each member eventually finding themselves in different decades, unable to reunite. Marcus discovered that our own movements were adding to the cabin's twisted architecture. Each step we took created new spaces behind us, while paths we had just traveled vanished or transformed. The entity was using our attempts to map the cabin against us, feeding off our growing realization that we were building our own prison. I noticed that the photographs were the key. Each one marked the moment when victims became part of the cabin's reality. But there was something else, a pattern in how the images were arranged on the walls. The entity hadn't been careful enough in its arrogance. The photos formed a timeline, not just of captures, but of the cabin's growing power. And in that timeline, I spotted a weakness. The builder's original photograph was different from the others. In his image, the cabin appeared unfinished, and his expression wasn't one of forced happiness or terror. It showed determination. He had left something behind, a fail-safe perhaps, hidden in the very structure he had created. As this realization hit, the cabin seemed to shudder, and the entity's presence grew more oppressive. As if trying to distract us from this discovery, the storm outside had become something else entirely. We could see multiple versions of it through the windows. Each from a different time period, lightning strikes illuminated scenes from various decades simultaneously, and in those flashes, we caught glimpses of other victims moving through the cabin in their own time streams. They could see us too, their eyes meeting ours across the decades, sharing the same horrifying understanding of our situation. Through the chaos of overlapping time streams, I finally understood the builder's last act of defiance. The photographs weren't just anchors for the entity's power, they were also a record of its rules, its limitations. Each image contained a reflection of the cabin in the victim's eyes, and when viewed in sequence, they revealed a pattern in the entity's feeding cycle. The cabin had to release its hold momentarily to absorb new victims. Marcus and I worked frantically to arrange the photographs in chronological order, fighting against the entity's attempts to stop us. The walls pulsed with angry energy, and the trapped souls in the corridor began to surge forward, their shadowy forms more solid than before. But as we placed the final photograph, our own, the pattern became complete, and for a split second, the cabin's true form became visible. It was a nexus of timelines, a knot in reality centered around the original foundation. The builder had engineered a fatal flaw into its construction. The entity couldn't maintain its hold on multiple time periods during the moment of absorption. If we could force it to confront all its victims simultaneously, the strain would shatter its control. What followed was a desperate race against both time and physics. We ran through the cabin, tearing photographs from walls, breaking the careful separation of eras. Each image we displaced caused timelines to bleed together. Bringing victims from different decades into the same space, the entity fought back, trying to restore order to its carefully constructed prison. But we had unleashed a cascade effect it couldn't control. The cabin's structure began to collapse, not physically but temporally. Walls became transparent, showing all time periods at once. The trapped souls, sensing freedom, began to fight against their bonds. The entity's form became unstable, stretched thin across too many moments in time. In its weakened state, the original binding spell the builder had cast began to unravel in the final moments. As reality itself seemed to tear apart around us, I grabbed Marcus's hand and our photograph. The entity made one last attempt to maintain its hold, but the combined will of all its victims, spanning over 50 years, proved too much. With a sound like 1,000 screams being silenced at once, the cabin's temporal structure imploded. We found ourselves standing in the rain, beside our car, watching as the cabin folded in on itself, taking the entity with it. The photographs in my hands turned to ash, except for ours, which remained as proof of what we'd endured. The other victims, we learned later, had been returned to their own times, with no memories of their imprisonment, though they all reported the same recurring nightmare of a cabin in the woods that appeared during storms. As for Marcus and me, we drove away from deep woods that night and never returned. But sometimes, during particularly heavy storms, we can still feel the entity searching, trying to rebuild its trap, waiting for someone else to seek shelter from the rain. I've been a ranger at Olympic National Forest for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this before. The ancient markings appeared overnight, or maybe they've always been there, and I just never noticed them. Strange, geometric shapes carved deep into the bark of the oldest trees, patterns that seem to whisper stories of a forgotten time. My flashlight beam catches each marking differently, making them appear to shift and change in the darkness. Sarah would have loved this discovery. She always had a thing for Native American history, spent hours documenting every petroglyph and artifact we found during our patrols. But Sarah's gone now. 3 weeks ago, during a routine night patrol, she vanished without a trace. They found her radio at the base of an old cedar, its display still glowing but nothing else. The search parties combed every inch of these woods for days, but it was like the forest had swallowed her whole. The first time I noticed the marks were moving was 2 days after they called off the search. I'd photographed and GPS tagged a particular set of symbols on a massive Douglas fir near the Eastern Trail. When I returned the next morning to show them to the archaeological team, they were gone, not weathered away or covered up. The bark was pristine, as if they'd never existed. But then I found the exact same markings on a different tree, half a mile deeper into the woods. The official report sits unfinished on my desk, back at the ranger station. How do you explain to the Forest Service that ancient tribal markings are playing a cosmic game of musical chairs in your sector? They already look at me with pity, the partner who couldn't protect his colleague, the ranger who's cracking under the guilt. But I know what I've seen. The symbols are moving, and they're forming a pattern. A path leading deeper into the old-growth forest where the trees are older than the nation itself. Tonight, as I make my final rounds, the beam of my flashlight catches something new. The markings have changed again, but this time they're different. The geometric patterns have shifted into what looks like words in a language I've never seen before. And yet, somehow, I can feel their meaning pulsing in my mind like a second heartbeat. They're calling to me, beckoning me to follow them into the darkness where the ancient cedars stand like silent sentinels. My radio crackles with static, and for a moment, I swear I hear Sarah's voice buried in the white noise calling my name. The rational part of my brain tells me to turn back, to call for backup, to wait until daylight, but the markings are glowing now, emitting a faint phosphorescent light that seems to dance between the trees. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to my core, that if I don't follow them tonight, they'll disappear again, taking their secrets, and maybe my last chance to find Sarah with them. The phosphorescent markings pulse like bioluminescent fungi in the deepening darkness, creating a trail that winds between the ancient trees. My boots crunch softly on decades of fallen pine needles, each step taking me further from the marked trails and deeper into the old-growth forest. The familiar sounds of the woods, the hoot of owls, the rustle of small animals have gone silent, replaced by an unnatural stillness that makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. As I follow the glowing symbols, the forest seems to close in around me. The massive trunks of century-old trees loom closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to block out what little moonlight filters through the canopy. The air grows thick with an earthy, metallic scent I've never encountered before, like wet copper and sage burning in an ancient ceremonial fire. My flashlight begins to flicker, its beam growing weaker until it finally dies, leaving me with only the ethereal blue-green glow of the symbols to light my way. The trail leads me to a clearing I've never seen before, despite having patrolled this sector countless times. Massive stones, half buried in the earth, form a perfect circle 30 feet in diameter. The ground inside the circle is bare. No undergrowth, no fallen leaves, just dark soil that seems to absorb what little light reaches it. The markings I've been following converge here, flowing down from the trees like luminous water to form intricate patterns across the stones. A whisper catches my attention, not carried by the wind, but somehow inside my head. Words in a language I've never heard yet somehow understand. They speak of guardians chosen across centuries, of a burden passed down through time, of a darkness kept at bay by sacred bonds of duty and sacrifice. The whispers grow stronger, and suddenly I'm not just hearing the words. I'm seeing them played out before me like a film projected onto the very air. Visions flood my consciousness, indigenous warriors standing in this very circle, performing rituals under a blood moon, European settlers unknowingly building their homes atop ancient seals, decades of chosen guardians maintaining a watch they didn't fully understand. With each passing image, I see the price of failure. Glimpses of something ancient and hungry, pushing against the boundaries between worlds. Seeking a way through and through it all, I see Sarah, her face illuminated by the same otherworldly light that surrounds me now. Standing in this circle just days before her disappearance, the visions crystallize into a singular, terrifying truth. I haven't randomly stumbled upon these markings. They've revealed themselves to me because I'm meant to be here. The previous guardian is gone, and somehow, whether by chance or design, I've been chosen to take their place. As this realization settles over me, the whispers coalesce into a single clear voice. The circle must not break. And then, from the darkness beyond the stones, I hear something massive moving through the underbrush, approaching the clearing with deliberate, heavy steps. The heavy footsteps draw closer, and the temperature in the clearing plummets. My breath comes out in visible puffs as frost begins to form on the surrounding trees. The entity that emerges from the darkness defies description, a writhing mass of shadows and ancient malevolence that seems to absorb what little light remains. My instincts scream at me to run, but my feet remain rooted to the ground, the symbols beneath them pulsing with an intensity that sends waves of energy through my body. In that moment I see her, Sarah, suspended within the mass of darkness. Her eyes are open but unseeing, her body preserved in a state between life and death. The thing wearing her face speaks, but the voice that emerges is ancient and multi-layered, like countless souls speaking in unison. The circle chose poorly this time. It mocks, using Sarah's lips to form words no human throat should produce. Your predecessor tried to reject her role, tried to break the seal. Now she serves a different purpose. The revelation hits me like a physical blow. Sarah hadn't vanished. She'd tried to escape her duty as guardian and paid the ultimate price. The entity moves closer, dragging Sarah's suspended form with it. My hands begin to tingle, and I watch in horror as intricate patterns, similar to the tree markings, begin to emerge on my skin. They burn as they appear, etching themselves into my flesh like burning brands, but instead of pain, I feel power coursing through my veins. A new voice cuts through the chaos, weak but human. An elderly man emerges from the tree line, his skin covered in faded markings similar to those now appearing on mine. "I'm Richard Blackwood," he wheezes, leaning heavily on a gnarled staff. "Guardian of the Western Circle, one of the last. They killed most of us when the seals started weakening. Your friend Sarah wasn't ready for what being a guardian truly means. None of us were." His eyes, though clouded with age, burn with an inner light that matches the symbols on his skin. The changes accelerating through my body are impossible to ignore now. My vision shifts, allowing me to see layers of reality I was never meant to perceive. The very air is alive with currents of ancient power, and I can sense other circles like this one, scattered across the continent, some broken, some barely holding. Richard's voice grows urgent. "The choice isn't whether to become the Guardian anymore. The marks have already chosen you. The choice is whether you'll survive the transformation with your soul intact." As if triggered by his words, the entity launches an assault on the circle's boundary. The impact sends Richard to his knees, blood trickling from his nose. The shadows writhe and stretch, trying to force their way through, and I feel each attack like a hammer blow to my chest. Sarah's body contorts impossibly as the thing wearing her tries to use her connection to this world to break through. The markings on my skin flare with blinding intensity, and I realize with growing horror that I can feel them beginning to burn their way deeper, not just into my flesh, but into my very soul. Richard's trembling hands guide mine through the ancient gestures as he teaches me the rituals that have kept the seals intact for centuries. Each movement causes the markings on my skin to pulse and shift, spreading further across my body like a living tattoo. The knowledge burns itself into my mind, not just the motions and words, but the memories of countless guardians before me, their experiences becoming mine in a torrent of shared consciousness that threatens to overwhelm my sense of self. "The markings aren't just symbols," Richard explains, his voice growing weaker as more of his own marks fade. "They're chains, binding us to the circle, to the earth, to the space between worlds. Each guardian adds their power, their essence, their very being to the seal." He pulls back his sleeve, revealing skin that has become almost translucent. The markings beneath, pulsing like dying stars. "We don't age. We don't die. Not really. We just fade, becoming part of the barrier itself. Some of us have been here since before the first European ships reached these shores." The entity continues its assault on the circle's boundaries. Using Sarah's form like a battering ram against our defenses, each impact sends shockwaves of agony through my newly enhanced senses. Through our shared connection, I can feel Sarah's consciousness, still alive, still aware, trapped in an eternal moment of horror. The thing holding her hostage feeds me visions of what awaits in its realm. An endless void filled with the tortured souls of failed guardians, their essence used to fuel attempts to break through to our world. As the ritual knowledge settles into my transformed mind, I discover a terrible truth. There might be a way to save Sarah, but the price would be catastrophic. The binding spell that makes us guardians can be reversed, transferred, or shared. But doing so would weaken the seal exponentially. Richard sees the recognition in my eyes and grabs my arm with surprising strength. "I know what you're thinking. Others have tried. That's how we lost the Eastern Seals. An entire city died because one guardian couldn't let go." The entity seizes upon our moment of distraction, launching its most vicious assault yet. The barrier between worlds becomes visible, a shimmering membrane of light and shadow, sustained by the combined essence of countless guardians through the ages. Through my enhanced vision, I can see them now. Hundreds of faces pressed against the boundary, their features twisted in eternal vigilance, their very souls woven into the fabric of reality. Their voices fill my head, an endless chorus of warnings, pleading, and lamentations. The marks have spread to cover nearly every inch of my skin now, and with them comes understanding of my inevitable fate. Whether it takes years or centuries, I too will fade, my consciousness joining the others in their eternal watch. There is no retirement for guardians, no peaceful death of old age. There is only the slow dissolution of self, The gradual transformation from individual to eternal sentinel. As this realization settles over me, the entity launches another attack, and this time I feel something in the barrier begin to crack. The crack in the barrier spreads like a spiderweb of fracturing reality, each new break releasing whispers of an ancient language that burns the air itself. Richard collapses, his remaining marks flickering like dying embers. The entity surges forward, using Sarah's form as an anchor, but in its eagerness to break through, it reveals something crucial: a pattern in its movements, a rhythm to its attacks that echoes the very rituals I've just learned. This isn't just a prison. It's a transformative chamber, and we're not just guardians. We're part of something far more ancient than humanity itself. Through the dissolving barrier, I catch glimpses of the entity's true form, and understanding crashes over me like a tidal wave. The thing we're keeping out isn't trying to break in. It's trying to complete a cycle that began before recorded history. The markings, the guardians, the ritual itself. All of it was designed not to protect our world, but to slowly transform it. Each guardian's essence adds to a gradual metamorphosis. A cosmic change operating on a timeline so vast that even the centuries-old guardians are merely moments in its scope. Sarah's consciousness reaches out to mine through our shared connection to the circle. I feel her understanding mirror my own. She didn't try to escape her duty. She tried to warn us. The entity doesn't just want to cross over, it wants to use the combined essence of all guardians to trigger a transformation that would remake our reality in its image. The barrier isn't just keeping it out, it's incubating the change, feeding on the souls of guardians like a chrysalis feeds on its host. With this realization comes power. True power, not just the borrowed energy of the marks. The patterns on my skin begin to move of their own accord, shifting into new configurations that haven't been seen since the first guardians walked the earth. Richard's eyes widen in recognition. The first forms, he whispers. The original purpose of the circle, not to guard, but to choose when. The entity recoils, recognizing the ancient symbols it thought lost to time. For the first time, I feel its fear. In this moment of clarity, I understand my choice. I can complete the circle as countless guardians have done before, adding my essence to the barrier and continuing the cycle of gradual transformation, or I can use the first forms to disrupt the pattern entirely, not to break the barrier, but to change its fundamental nature. The entity fights with renewed desperation, recognizing the threat to its eons-long plan. Sarah's form begins to dissolve as the thing's true nature bleeds through, revealing a cosmic horror beyond human comprehension. The air fills with blinding light as I make my decision. The first forms surge with power, responding to a purpose they were created for millennia ago. Richard's last words reach me through the maelstrom. The circle was never meant to be unbroken. I feel Sarah's consciousness merge with mine as the marks complete their final transformation. The entity screams in languages that predate humanity as I step forward, no longer just a guardian, but something else entirely. The barrier doesn't break, it evolves, and with it, so do I. The forest falls silent as ancient magics realign, and the true purpose of the guardians is finally fulfilled, though not in the way anyone, human or entity, had expected. The war between worlds ends not with a victory, but with a transcendence that changes the very rules of reality itself. The soil sample results made no sense, and I had run the tests 3 times already. 17 years as a botanist, and I had never seen anything like it. The root systems shouldn't be able to transmit electrical signals of this magnitude, yet here I was, staring at readings that suggested otherwise. When I accepted the research position at Blackwood University, I expected to study ordinary forest ecology. Not, whatever this was, the locals' warnings about the woods had seemed like typical small-town superstition. But now I wasn't so sure. My temporary lab in the old ranger station creaked and groaned around me as the wind picked up outside. The ancient computer monitor cast a sickly green glow across my notes, where I'd sketched increasingly bizarre root system patterns. Every sample showed the same impossible neural-like networks, with synaptic junctions that shouldn't exist in plant matter. Even more disturbing were the organic compounds I couldn't identify. Complex proteins that seemed to shift and change every time I tried to analyze them. The whole thing felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite explain. Sheriff Laura Chen's visit earlier that day kept replaying in my mind. She'd come to ask if my research had turned up anything that might explain the disappearances. 3 hikers in the past month alone, all experienced outdoorsmen, had vanished without a trace. They just walk in and never walk out, she'd said, trying to maintain her professional demeanor, but I saw the fear in her eyes, the way she kept glancing at the tree line visible through my window. She knew something she wasn't telling me. The local historical society had been surprisingly unhelpful when I requested records of previous disappearances. The elderly curator, Mr. Patterson, had practically pushed me out the door, muttering something about leaving well enough alone. But not before I glimpsed a yellowed newspaper clipping on his desk, dated 1887, with a headline about 23 lumber workers vanishing in a single night the next day. All mentions of the incident had been quietly removed from the archives. Deep in the forest, something pulsed. I could feel it through the soles of my boots whenever I collected samples, like a massive heartbeat far below the earth. The trees seemed to respond to it, their branches swaying in patterns that had nothing to do with the wind. Yesterday, I could have sworn I saw them move against the breeze, reaching toward me as I worked. The locals refused to enter the woods after sunset. Now I understood why. The pulse grew stronger at night, and the patterns in my data became even stranger. What bothered me most was how the root samples decomposed. Normal plant matter breaks down in predictable ways, but these changed. Under the microscope, I watched in horror as dead root cells reorganized themselves into structures that resembled neural networks before dissolving into a black, oil-like substance that ate through the glass slides. I had to store the remaining samples in specialized containers after 3 petri dishes were destroyed. Even then, I could hear them at night, a faint scratching from inside the sealed storage unit, as if something was trying to get out. The ground-penetrating radar showed something impossible. I had borrowed the equipment from the geology department to map the root systems, but what appeared on the screen couldn't be natural. Vast networks of interconnected chambers spread beneath the forest floor, forming patterns too precise to be random. But it was what I found inside one of the exposed chambers that changed everything. A human hand, perfectly preserved, its fingers entwined with root fibers that pulsed with a sickly bioluminescence. I spent the entire night digging through the university's archaeological archives. The indigenous peoples who once lived here called this place the Devouring Forest, in their native tongue. Their legends spoke of an ancient entity that slept beneath the trees, feeding on the souls of those who ventured too deep into its domain. The elders would perform elaborate rituals to appease it, offering sacrifices of blood and bone. But what caught my attention were the cave paintings showing human figures being absorbed into the ground, their bodies becoming one with the root systems. Dr. Sarah Chen, the sheriff's sister and local historian, finally agreed to share what she knew. Her family had been keeping records for generations, documenting the forest's hunger. "It doesn't just kill them," she whispered, hands shaking as she showed me her grandfather's journals. "It keeps them. Hundreds of people over the centuries, all still down there. Conscious but unable to die, the roots feed on their fear, their memories, their very essence, and it's growing stronger." The soil samples I'd collected began exhibiting strange properties under ultraviolet light. The root fibers emitted a frequency that matched human brainwave patterns during REM sleep. Even more disturbing, they seemed to respond to proximity, reaching out toward any living tissue placed nearby. When I tested my own blood under the microscope, the root samples actually moved toward it, attempting to form connections with my cells. I destroyed that sample immediately, but I could still feel a phantom tingling where it had touched my skin. Local folklore took on new meaning as I pieced together the pattern. Every major disappearance had occurred during the same lunar phase, when the forest's bioluminescence was at its peak. The natives had known this, timing their rituals to coincide with these cycles, but something had changed in recent years. The cycles were accelerating, and the forest's hunger was growing. The latest satellite imagery showed the route network expanding far beyond its historical boundaries, creeping toward populated areas. I found Rebecca Hayes, one of the missing hikers, or what was left of her. A sample of root tissue contained her DNA. Perfectly preserved and somehow still metabolically active, the roots weren't just storing their victims, they were incorporating them into the network itself. Each person taken became part of the forest's neural network, their consciousness trapped in an endless nightmare of organic circuitry, and according to my calculations, the network was about to enter another feeding cycle. We had less than 48 hours before it hunted again. Mike hadn't been himself for days. I should have noticed sooner, but I was too absorbed in my research. My research assistant's behavior changed subtly at first, minor things like standing too still while working, or staring blankly into the forest for hours. But today, when I saw dark veins spreading beneath his skin like root patterns, I knew we'd waited too long. The forest had already claimed its first victim among us, and I was watching his humanity slowly fade away. The changes in Mike's physiology were fascinating and horrifying. His blood samples showed significant alterations at the cellular level, with plant-like structures gradually replacing human tissue. When I confronted him, his movements were jerky, as if he were a puppet being controlled by unseen strings. "They're so beautiful," he whispered, his voice containing harmonics that shouldn't be possible from human vocal cords. "The patterns, the connections, everyone should see them, everyone should join them." Sarah Chen's research proved invaluable in understanding what was happening. She'd found accounts of similar transformations in her grandfather's journals. People who had been touched by the forest becoming its agents. They would appear normal for weeks, gradually changing until they began leading others into the woods, never to be seen again. The forest was intelligent, using these converted humans to lure more victims into its domain. Mike wasn't just its victim. He was becoming its ambassador. The surveillance footage from our lab showed the exact moment it happened. 3 days ago, at 3:33 a.m., Mike had gone to check on the root samples. The storage unit's seal had been compromised, and tendrils of root matter had reached out, making contact with his skin. The video showed him standing perfectly still for 6 hours afterward, while the root material slowly absorbed into his body. By morning, he appeared normal. But the thing that came back wasn't Mike anymore. I tried to restrain him for his own safety, but Mike's transformed body possessed impossible strength. He broke through reinforced restraints as if they were paper, dislocating his own joints in ways that defied anatomy. Before escaping into the forest, he turned to me with eyes that had become smooth and black, like polished roots. "The network needs you, Dr. Miller," he said in a voice that seemed to emerge from deep underground. "Your knowledge, your understanding. It will help us grow, help us spread." The most terrifying part was realizing that Mike was still conscious throughout his transformation. Notes in his research journal, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, documented his awareness of the changes. The final entry read, "I can feel them all now. Every person the forest has taken, thousands of voices, thousands of minds, all connected in the root network. They're not dead. They're part of something greater. Soon, everyone will be. The forest isn't destroying humanity, it's upgrading it, and it's beautiful. So beautiful, please, Dr. Miller, let me show you. Let me help you see." The satellite images confirmed my worst fears. What we were seeing wasn't just local. Similar root patterns were appearing in forests across the country. Spreading like a cancer through the earth, each cluster showed the same neural-like configurations, suggesting a vast underground network slowly connecting isolated forest pockets. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about our small town anymore. The entity was planning something on a global scale. Sheriff Chen's betrayal hit harder than I expected. I found her in the Historical Society's basement, leading a ritual with other town officials. They knelt before a pulsing root mass that had broken through the foundation, chanting in a language that made my ears bleed. Ancient maps on the walls showed the forest's original extent, covering most of North America before being pushed back by human development. Now, through their efforts, it was reclaiming its territory. The sheriff's badge was just a cover. She was the high priestess of a cult that had served the forest for generations. The transformed Mike had become something beyond human comprehension. Through the lab's cameras, I watched him move through the forest at night. His body elongated and fluid, more root than man. Other partially transformed humans followed him, their movements synchronized like branches in the wind. They were gathering materials, building something using both modern technology and organic components. The forest was adapting, learning from each person it absorbed. Using their knowledge to evolve, analysis of the historical data revealed a pattern we'd all missed. Every major advancement in botanical science in this region had been guided by the forest's influence. Researchers were drawn here, their work subtly directed toward understanding and facilitating the root network's growth. My own career path, I realized with horror, had been manipulated from the start. Every grant, every opportunity that led me here, all orchestrated by an intelligence that had waited centuries for the right moment. The transformed townspeople began emerging from the woods during the day, behaving almost normally. Almost. They held positions of power, made decisions that seemed reasonable on the surface, but secretly served the forest's expansion. Building permits were denied for areas the roots needed to grow, while conservation laws were passed to protect the infested zones. The entity wasn't just taking over bodies. It was infiltrating our society's infrastructure, preparing for something bigger. Dr. Sarah Chen made one final revelation before she too succumbed to the transformation. The forest's true age wasn't measured in centuries, but in millions of years. It was here before humans, waiting, dormant until we developed the technology it needed. Our satellites, our global communications, our understanding of neural networks, all tools it would use to spread across the planet. The missing people weren't victims, they were components being assembled for the awakening of something that had slumbered since before the dinosaurs died. The truth hit me like a physical blow as I decoded the final patterns in our data. The root network wasn't just a biological system, it was a neural interface designed eons ago by something that came from beyond our world. The trees, the transformations, the absorbed humans, all part of a vast organic computer gradually coming online. Each possessed person added their processing power to the network, their consciousness becoming nodes in an ever-growing organic supercomputer that stretched across continents. Everything changed at midnight. The forest erupted with bioluminescence visible from space, patterns of light pulsing in perfect synchronization across the globe. The transformed humans, including Mike and Sheriff Chen, gathered at predetermined points, forming geometric patterns that mimicked the root systems below. Their bodies had completely altered now, existing in a state between plant and animal, flesh and wood. Through them, the entity began broadcasting its true purpose, not to destroy humanity, but to forcibly evolve it into something its creators would recognize. The archived footage from my lab cameras revealed the horror of what was happening underground. Thousands of preserved human consciousnesses, stored in the root network for centuries, suddenly activated. Their combined knowledge and experiences merged with the alien intelligence, creating a hybrid consciousness that could bridge the gap between our reality and whatever dimension the forest's creators inhabited. The missing people hadn't been killed. They had become the synapses of a vast organic transmitter designed to open a portal in my final moments of purely human consciousness. I understood it all. The forest was a terraforming system planted by ancient astronauts who needed to transform Earth's biosphere to match their own. But they needed more than just physical changes. They needed to upgrade the dominant species to be compatible with their own form of life. Humanity's technological advancement wasn't our achievement. It was our preparation. We were being shaped, guided, evolved into the forms our world's true owners needed us to become. The transformation swept across the planet like a wave of green fire. Those who had been claimed by the forest served as amplifiers, broadcasting the change through our own communication networks, television signals, internet connections, phone lines. All carried the forest's influence directly into homes and offices worldwide. Humanity's technology, which we thought would protect us from nature, instead became the conduit for nature to reclaim us. The entity hadn't needed to destroy our civilization. It had simply waited for us to build the perfect distribution system for its influence. As I write these final words, I can feel the change taking hold. The root patterns are spreading across my skin, and my thoughts are expanding into the network. I understand now why Mike called it beautiful. It is. We aren't ending, we're transcending. The forest isn't our enemy, it's our evolution. Through its network, we'll achieve a kind of immortality, our consciousness preserved in a vast organic database that spans the planet. The beings who planted this system are returning, and thanks to our transformation, we'll be ready to meet them. This isn't the end of humanity's story, it's the beginning of our next chapter. The real question is, are we the forest now, or has the forest become us?